think before going into the study, I just wanted to give also a brief outlook of the macroeconomic context. I think it started during the study, but I think took some proportion that we cannot ignore. So this presentation will have a bit two parts. One is giving an outlook on where we are going and the implication on the consumer behavior, and the second one will be dedicated to the study. I think first, Juan just mentioned it, right? But why we are actually very proud to be part of the study and why we are also very concerned by the industry is that we are talking about a very important sector for the European economy. 8% of the GDP. We mentioned the largest employer in Europe with 13% of the people working in this industry. And obviously very important in terms of volume of transaction and point of contact socially for our countries. So that's why actually when we had the opportunity to be partner with Eurocommerce, we say absolutely yes to this report because we think it's an interesting time, but also a very challenging time, and we wanted to bring some facts on where the industry is and where the industry is going. So what changed and what was reinforced since the report that we did is indeed the change in the macroeconomics that was much faster than expected and probably deeper. I think three key messages. I think nothing new, you all know, but we'll bring some facts here. Inflation is clearly broader and more persistent than we thought originally. And the implication is direct on the disposable income, right? So it didn't bring all the economic model behind. I mean, it's quite obvious, but differ across country depending on the energy prices. But we see obviously that the increase in energy prices is just compressing the disposable income with direct impact on the consumption. And the third message that we mentioned in introduction is this has an impact obviously on the top line, but I mean, it's not so important, so relevant as the bottom line. And obviously energy prices plus tension on the prices are actually affecting the profitability of the retailer, which are already quite low compared to some other industry, and quite low in Europe compared to some other regions. Let's go into each of these elements. So the first one is inflation. I think the element has been really the acceleration that we have seen in the last months with an inflation which is now 5 to 6 percent per year. And obviously this differ a lot by category. Energy prices are skyrocketing, right? 40% increase. Once again, depending on the public policy, the impact on consumer is different. We know that many countries have put some form of protection on the energy prices. But we see today a bit of gap between energy prices and consumer pricing and core inflation be much lower, right? So it's the consumer inflation is catching up slowly, but I think you see the impact recently being very high. And obviously there is a direct correlation between consumer confidence and the level of inflation. So the line is actually what we call the consumer confidence index. And you see that actually over the last weeks and months, it has been really falling as actually the inflation is starting to eat consumer through the energy prices. And as I was mentioning in introduction, disposable income, of course, is compressed, and there is direct implication on how much consumers are buying, but also what they are buying, and we are going to see that in a second. If you look at by category actually of where people are actually spending their money, I think the big impact is of course on the right side. You see people are saving less, so they are starting to put less into saving, obviously, because they need to spend more on consumption. But also they are spending differently. So you see they protect obviously the food and essential part, and they are spending less on the discretionary items. So discretionary item being typically non-food categories, beauty, furniture. I mean, you see consumer electronics and so on. And these subsectors are actually very much hit by the current situation. Some are actually more hit than the other because they benefit during the COVID from an anticipation of purchase, right? So many people consume more electronics, more DIY during the COVID crisis because they were at home. So now you have a bit the double effect of people having already anticipated their purchase plus the impact of the decrease in discretionary spend, which are hitting very hard some of the subcategory like consumer electronics. Another effect, so I didn't bring, but I think if you want to know more about the consumer behavior, we have a website and I'm happy to share with you with the latest trend. But I think the other thing that we see is that people are starting to trade down. I think this could be somehow beneficial in some point for retailer because people are buying more private label, but still we see a massive shift to trade down in multiple categories. Impact on profitability is very direct, right? So there are two levels of impact. Here we just illustrate, so it's illustrative, right? But we just illustrate the energy prices. There is one also on the margin, because I think as Juan mentioned in the introduction, we start to see tension on ability to pass the price. So how does it translate very concretely is the increase of promotion. And basically, some retailers are actually reinvesting their margin to maintain their volume, which is obviously not sustainable because we know the bottom line of the profitability of the industry, which is, by the way, also hit by other costs like energy. So I think those that actually try to maintain the volume by doing promotion and at the same time facing the energy crisis are now facing some severe financial situation. And I don't want to mention on top people that have actually some debt. We all know that the cost of capital has increased a lot. So obviously on top of the operating margin, those that actually have high level of leverage are also facing increased cost of capital, which is further deteriorating their net income. So I think this was the economic context. You all know about it. I think what is actually interesting, and we have the chance to discuss during the next chat, is how to deal with that while there is an imperative for transformation. So this was actually the report that probably most of you had the chance to read, where we actually try to assess what is the financial, the investment needed in order to deal with the triple transition. What we call triple transition actually are three elements. One, the sustainability and the need to cope with Paris Agreement and move to net zero. The second one is digitalization with the increased share of sales coming from the online. Also, this is a bit slowing down versus the COVID period. It's still very strong. And third, which is probably the most important one, because this is the enabler of the two, how to deal with the evolution of skills and talent to deliver this transformation. So maybe let me go quickly into each of the, it's really a brief summary of this long report, but just to give you the key facts and so you can leave with a clear figure in mind. I think the first one, which for me was very important one, right, is that if you take the industry, it represents 40% of the emission. So we are talking about a sector which also is very important as part of the CO2 emission. But, this is very important, only 5% are actually in the direct control of the sector. So that's the paradox, because if you think scope 3, you say, wow, it's 40%. If you think about scope 1 and scope 2, it's only 5. And there is a clear implication on that, which is, one, the sector needs to do a job in cutting the emission on the scope 1, and we assess that 50 to 90% of the emission could be reduced. But there is a need to collaborate along the value chain with farmer, with food producer, with CPG company in order to work on the overall supply chain decarbonation. So just remember, 40% of the sector, 5 only in direct control. If we think about actually direct control and what the sector could do, I'm not going to go into all the levers now, but there are 3 main categories of levers that are detailed in the report. First, net zero operation. So how you actually can move to renewable energy, both in terms of store operation, headquarter, and fleets, as well as for your private label part, adopt net zero approach. The second one, which is quite important, is the role of the sector in promoting consumer behavior. So we know that actually through the assortment to the product that you put in store, retail has a particular role of prescription and influence versus the consumer. And I think we observed actually now a lot of retailers actually are measuring their CO2 score of their assortment. So they are adding as one more KPI of their assortment, which is the footprint of what they are selling. And the third one, which is actually an opportunity, it's about circularity and waste management. Why it's an opportunity? Basically, it's new source of revenues, and typically the valuation of this business are actually interesting. And it's a way for retailer also to bring investor. We're not saying that everything should be done alone, right? But it's a source of creating new source of revenues, and it's quite important considering what we have seen in the first part. Not going to go into the detail here, but I think we have we build the decarbonation, what we call the cost curve. The good news still is that a part of the circa 40-50% of the lever could be creating value. So it's not a question of profitability, it's a question of level of investment. So for example, to be very concrete, if you shift your store to green, it's creating value, and it's even more creating value considering the new energy price. The problem is the cost actually, how much you have to invest to change your fridge, to change your parking lot, to change your light. So it's a question of investment. But the good news, it's part of the lever for decarbonation of the scope 1 are actually positive in terms of return on investment. The second lever is digitalization. I think one number which important to remember, 90% of the growth will be driven by the online. So you cannot just ignore the fact that your future growth will come from the channel with the implication on your store network and your real estate. This is not new, but it's clearly as accelerated with the COVID. And the more it accelerated, the more problematic is how you manage your physical footprint. The other thing is that actually online has a lot of implication because online goes also with new needs, new expectation. For example, in terms of supply chain. You don't want what you are buying online to be delivered in 4 or 5 days, right? Now the new expectation is you have it in 1 or 2 days. This has a lot of implications on how retailers need to upgrade their supply chain. And this is clearly an area of major investment for the next months and years, which is how retailers are evolving their supply chain to be an efficient omni-channel supply chain. There is also an opportunity, which is analytics. So how you actually get smarter in your operation, both in commerce and operation. And here it's also a major need of investment because clearly the pure player are investing more in that space. And the traditional retail need to catch up in terms of being smarter about the consumer, smarter about how the demand is going to evolve, and smarter in their operation. And this is often requiring a major upgrade of the traditional IT. And I think you can ask every retailer, they will all tell you actually their nightmare or their problem is how can I upgrade my core IT. Just an example on analytics. The good news is that there are not so many use cases to be developed, but clearly this requires to have the data infrastructure, this requires to have data scientists, and this requires a lot of change management. But the good news is that actually the use cases for upgrading the operation through analytics are identified. They are here, and now the question is more into the execution. Last but not least, so we mentioned the sector being the largest employer in Europe, and we have seen actually the nature of what the sector needs to deliver is changing. So this has a lot actually of implication on the skill that are required. We observe today that most of the people are managing that very incrementally without the vision of the end game. So how many data scientists I will need, how many social media managers I will need. So, we really, through the report, wanted to emphasize the need, and I think I'm glad that what you announced on the skill pact, right? That the sector need to proactively know how many people, what are the skills that are needed, right? So very detailed mapping of the skill, and how to make sure that people get reskill or upskill in order to deliver what we expect from them tomorrow. We actually estimate the number of people to be reskill or upskill to 10 to 13 million on an annual basis. And part of actually the job will be new, because I mean, we believe, and you just explain that on the next page, that you can upskill or reskill people to a certain point, right? So some jobs will be new, and we estimate that 0.8 to 1.5 will be new job with new skill that you don't have today. With a question on your employee value proposition in order to attract and keep these people. On the next page, oops. Okay. Oh. On this page, actually, you have a bit of an illustration of the need for reskill, right? So we typically look at the number of skills that are needed, and you can actually look at, so I think it's about, looking at the baseline of the people today, looking at the baseline of the people tomorrow, and say, what are the new skills that I need for each of the job? And typically, then you count the number of new skills that you will have. One skill, you say, is a significant upscaling, but it works, right? So it's how I can upgrade this skill. So for example, is someone moving from just doing cashier to someone doing clienteling, for example. Then you have actually two skills. So it means that you need to do that, but sometimes, I don't know, you need to develop some analytical capabilities. So here it's another level of skilling. And we consider when you have more than two, so typically three, it's about hiring these skills because you are not going to be able to upgrade the people. But I think having this detailed view of the sector and putting in place the training program will be very much key in order to make sure that the sector can evolve. This is clearly the unlock for the other levers. Let's talk about Monet. And this was the primary goal of the study. We assessed that the need for investment is equal to 0.8 to 1.6 percentage point on top of what the retail is already investing. Obviously, considering the level of profitability of the sector, it's a bit of a wish today that this will be achieved. But how this could be achieved, we're going to discuss it later, is clearly by first reinvesting part of the profit that the sector is doing, so protecting the level of profitability and developing the resilience, which was the first part of the presentation, is key because you need to finance that. Then you will need probably to reallocate some of the capital expenditure, and we will discuss that probably in the next session. This 0.8 and 1.6 is significant, and you will see that indeed it's largely concentrated on the sustainability and digitalization. Some as actually is creating money, right? So it's a matter about finding the investment, finding the capacity to invest. One thing that we believe it's important is when you look at the sector compared to actually North America, sector in Europe versus sector in North America, we have a gap today in the level of investment of the sector, which is also linked to a lower level of profitability. 3.6 is the level of investment in Europe. We estimated 6.7 in North America. So almost twice the level of investment, meaning that the retail sector in Americas has started to transform itself and is investing a lot in transforming, especially on the technology part. I mean, you see on the right side the total spend in technology. Europe, 2.1. North America, 3.3. And the pure player are typically investing from 4.5 to 6. So give you an idea of the gap today in the level of investment without mentioning the size, because typically the average size of our player in Europe is smaller than the size of the player in the US, so you have less effect of scale. And indeed, when we asked through the survey that we did with Eurocommerce, 50% of the retailers think they don't have today the right level of resources in order to fund this transformation. So they largely agree that it's a top priority, but they are short in terms of resources to deliver on this transformation. So maybe conclusion, and then we have the chance to discuss more in detail, right? One, crisis is here. So I think there is no way not to see it. So the question is how you take, you are building an holistic plan of action to develop resilience. Resilience is not to generate more profit. First is to protect the profit. And second is to maintain the ability to invest. And the second one is actually where you need to invest, the triple transition. So technology, sustainability, and people. It's a priority. And I think this should be actually higher on the agenda of the company and clearly embedded into the planning process of the different retailers. And I think this is the right season because everyone is doing their budget at the moment. And the last one is indeed that the level of investment required is high and that the sector will need support in order to finance and manage the skill transition. So we'll have the chance to develop that later on. Thank you.